All righty, and we are back. Today we are talking with Eduardo Castañeda-Díaz. He is a candidate for state representative in the 13th District of Washington. Hi there, Mr. Castañeda-Díaz. It's great to be speaking with you today.
Hello, Mr. Martinez. Thank you for the invitation. I am honored and humbled to be running to represent my district in Central Washington, and I thank you for your time today.
Yeah, of course. It's great to be able to sit down and speak with you. I have some questions prepared to kind of direct the conversation today, but I think the vision for all of this is that it's more of a conversation than an interview. We want to learn about you and about the policies that, of course, you advocate for and are running for, but kind of want to know the full you, not just the political side of you, but also not just the personal side of you. So hopefully this isn't too formal or anything. But yeah, I have some questions. I can just get kind of started. I'm curious, Eduardo, have you always lived in the 13th district? And if not, I guess, how did you come to call this place home? And kind of what's your backstory with that?
Yes, thank you for the question. My parents came to the United States in the 1980s. They were born in Mexico in the state of Jalisco. When my father was 12, his father died from pneumonia from working in the cold temperature or wherever the case may be. He got sick and died from pneumonia when my dad was 12. And he was sent to the United States of America, and he was adopted by my great aunts and great uncle in the Santa Cruz area, Watsonville, California. So he grew up there from the age of 12, went to high school in California and graduated in 1989, I believe, at the age of 19. And then when my mother was 14 years old, she got human trafficked. She paid to cross the desert in a river because she was a survivor of domestic violence from my grandfather. And they said they were in poverty. They had no other choice. So my mother came without proper inspection by authorities, and they came to Washington State. And my parents were childhood sweethearts. They met when they were 7, 8, or 9 years old, and they rekindled their story in the United States. And then I was born in California 10 years later, and they worked throughout that time in agriculture. 2 months after being born in California, my parents moved back to Washington because that's where my mom's family was. So my father packed bags and moved to Washington. So I've been in Washington since the age of 2 months. I'm 27 years old now. So I've been here for the last 27 years of my life, minus the first 2 months of my life.
Right. Fantastic. It's great to hear about your childhood. And, you're almost 100% of your life in Washington State, right? Just that 2 months. Yeah, so can you tell me a little bit about the 13th district? I think I'm curious as someone who personally doesn't live in the 13th district, and I'm sure, your take on the district is also important for people to know.
Thank you, Xavier, for the question. As you mentioned, I've been in the 13th district for about 98% of my life, but I consider myself a native, even though I wasn't born here. I have no memories of California. I grew up in the 13th in Quincy, Washington. The 13th district encompasses all of Kittitas and all of the counties, and the southern half of Grand County. The upper part of Grand County goes into the 12th district, and then 3 precincts in Yakima County in the Sela area. It's mainly agricultural. We have crops such as apples or blueberries, and we have processing plants and a big up-and-coming tech industry powered by the data centers that came in the early 2000s due to the low-cost electricity that comes from the Columbia rivers as a source of cheap hydroelectric power and relatively known natural disasters. But as we see now, there's fires, but there's no earthquakes. We're not prone to tornadoes or anything. So these tech centers are beginning to prop up, and there's a big up-and-coming real estate market in Central Washington due to what I foresee becoming the Silicon Valley of Washington. It's a weird mixture. I grew up in rural Washington. I grew up on a 10-acre farm with animals of all kinds. And I see the horizon being taken over by concrete and electric wires. It's something that we have to deal with in our generation, and trying to regulate industry versus keeping our agricultural industry and our environment safe. So that's something that our generation is going to have to take care of, as well as the looming dangers of industrialization, which is climate change. So overall, it's a very beautiful place to grow up. It's changing every day, and I'm glad to be seeing it with my own eyes.
Fantastic, fantastic. That's super interesting. Going back into kind of your story, Eduardo, reading your bio and stuff about you in the newspapers, and of course your campaign website, it seems like you have a ton of life experiences already at such a young age. You were at WSU, you went to the armed forces, law school, grad school, and now what about all of that led to you running for office at a relatively young age?
Yes, thank you for the question. As you mentioned, I'm a graduate at Washington State University. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from a four-year institution or any college of any sorts. I'm currently in my master's program at California State University. I did attend law school for 1 year, but I decided to drop out because it wasn't for me. I decided to take a different path in life, and I reorganized, and I decided to focus on my privilege as an American citizen, as a person who is educated. And I realized from the beginning, since the age of 5, that I've had the privilege of being born here. I've had cousins who have been undocumented, and they haven't had the privilege to have this education. And I've never been one to brag about my accomplishments, but I've used them as leverage to make change in my community. So for the last 10 years of my life, I've been in the front lines of advocating for immigrants' rights, for students' rights, for higher education, for teachers, and for farm workers. And it all coalesced after the Trump administration came in and shook things up. And it really made us reanalyze our priorities and our life goals. I ultimately made the decision that we are at a point in American history where we can't stand by idly, just watch things unfold. I wanted to be part of a counter movement to the uprising of fascism in this nation. And I've seen it coming since 2015, and it's been solidified in 2020. And this election is going to be very important for everybody to get out. And I knew that the choices were none. My opponent was going to go unchallenged, and I stepped up to run for office to be a choice for change in my district. And I'm glad that we've compiled all the support throughout the last 6 months. We've had endorsements from Washington Education Association, Equal Rights Washington, as well as Planned Parenthood today, affordable housing initiatives, the Washington Latino Caucus, among many other endorsements from different progressive organizations in Washington. So we've been grassroots, we've been people powered, and here we are today talking to you.
Right, right. So I'm curious, you talked about all those broad experiences from, being a child of immigrants to, serving, the country in armed forces, and, taking a kind of a dabble into law school. I'm curious how all of those experiences kind of impact what policies and what issues you really find most important or find important, and kind of your stances on them. Maybe you could comment on that.
Yes, thank you for the question again. As you mentioned, I've served for 5 years in the armed forces. I'm going into my last 5 months of my contract in the National Guard. In March 2021, my contract will be over. So I've had those experiences of serving with women and men in the U.S. Army who have deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. Myself, I haven't deployed, but I have had the privilege to have conversations and work at the VA as a volunteer at the hospital with veterans from World War II to Vietnam to the Gulf War and the ones I mentioned previously, Iraq and Afghanistan. And these experiences have really shaped my perspectives on helping veterans. My main priority is to assist veterans who are dealing with PTSD, housing insecurity, homelessness, food insecurity, when their education or employment rights are being violated. I want to be that person that speaks up for my fellow veterans who have gone to war and back, and they are forgotten. They are tossed to the streets, literally, as a forgotten and invisible community. And I feel that I can use my privilege and education to write policy, and also touching on my military experience to have that credibility when speaking about what I want to do to change and make Washington a better place to live for all.
Certainly, certainly. Very interesting. So I have a couple of questions specifically about Washington and your district. Obviously, a lot has happened in the world since you kind of described becoming politically involved, and I think one of the most glaring and probably most obvious is the pandemic that we're currently in. This COVID-19 crisis. First of all, I'm curious, in your perspective, how has COVID affected the 13th district?
Well, the 13th district and Washington state have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic due to the great economic crises that we are experiencing not only in Washington but in the U.S. In general, because we're trying to keep people alive, and Governor Jay Inslee has had to make some tough decisions based on scientific fact to keep people alive, such as temporarily shutting down small businesses or restaurants, inconveniencing folks with having to mandate face masks. It's unfortunate, but it's something for the greater good that our states and our district need to understand, that we are here as a collective. We are here as a state to keep each other alive. So it's been a very hostile, intense atmosphere in our states, as you may know, regarding the whole politicization of the whole entire situation, where the right wing and the left wing argue about the way in which we should be handling the pandemic. It's been politicized entirely, and I believe that's wrong. I think we should be referring and calling on our scientists and medical professionals to make these decisions. Of course, we've also had people, unfortunately, pass away and get sick from the virus. So it's affected our district. It's affected Washington, and it's affected the United States, where we see that more than 200,000 folks have died. And it's unfortunate that the revelation came out a few weeks ago that our President Donald Trump knew since February that the virus was airborne, that it was highly contagious, 4 or 5 times more deadly than the flu, while stating the opposite. It's criminal, and it's something that we've had to deal with. In Washington, where he's tried to blackmail us for being a democratically led state, or for opposing his very unscientific stances on this virus. But we're making it through. We're going to make it through together. And I am ready to fill that seat in January and help lead us back into a better economy that's safer for all.
Right. I'm curious in specific to the state and to the district, how, I guess, what you would do differently than what was done with state leadership or with district leadership in the last 6 months. What are some goals you have, if elected, to help kind of alleviate the, of course, public health and economic crises that are going on in the midst of this pandemic?
Yes, thank you for the question. I actually answered this question earlier today in a debate with my opponent, Tom Dent. with the Yakima Herald Republic. We were asked about the budget. The budget is going to be one of the biggest issues. The state budget is going to be one of the biggest issues coming into January. We both agreed on it, but we had different stances. My opponent, Tom Dent, said that we have a spending problem, not a budget problem. But Washington State is ranked bottom 3 in tax fairness, according to sources. And one of the reasons is that low-income and middle-class families pay a higher proportion of their own incomes through sales, excise, or property taxes as compared to these corporations or some of these 1% families in Washington State. So, as you may know, some of the most powerful companies in the world are based out of the Puget Sound area. Boeing, Microsoft, Amazon, and all 3 of them are funding my opponent's campaign. So I called him out today, and I asked him, why do you take money from these corporations and then advocate for not taxing them? That's unfair. I believe that we can flip our tax system upside down, make it fair for low income and middle class families that have to not only be mother and father, but they have to be tutor and teacher and taking care of and babysitter. All this can be alleviated by raising taxes on these multi-billion corporations based in the Seattle area, these wealthy Washingtonians that can help alleviate some of the socioeconomic impacts to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as low-income families in our states. I think that the biggest issue that I can help with is trying to advocate for these economic reliefs for families that have been historically marginalized due to their position in the United States. And as statistics indicate, Latino families are only 17% of the population, but they make up 40% of the COVID cases in Washington State. And that because they have to continue working, because they are essential workers. They are working in our agricultural field and service work, and that's unfair. And it's all about the way that money is distributed in our states.
Totally. Makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, also specifically about your district a little bit. And so I thought I'd focus a little bit on the 13th district. So I was kind of doing some research on the 13th district the other day, and I found something kind of interesting. Based off numbers in the 2010 census, about 21% of the population in Kittitas County and just about 20% of the population of Grant County were living in poverty. Both of those were greater than the national average, which at the time was about 15%. Of course, those numbers were the most recent census numbers. So that's what I went with. Yeah, I'm curious what your financial stance on, what programs or financial incentives are there to maybe move some of the money that might be concentrated in other areas, more wealthy areas of the state, to the 13th district, or equally spread stuff out. I in another interview I mentioned a wealth tax, so I'll stick with that again. Would you be in support of a wealth tax? Excuse me, a wealth tax to try to reallocate that wealth?
Yes, I believe that there should be a taxation initiative on these corporations that are worth trillions of dollars and pay zero in federal taxes, zero in state income tax, because there is no state income tax, because these corporations have lobbied our politicians to not enact it because they fund them. Amazon, Boeing, Microsoft, Alaska Airlines, Chevron, Phillips 66, Puget Sound Energy, Cascade Natural Gas are all funding my opponent, Representative Tom Dent. He is advocating against their taxation for a reason. That's why I'm pressing him so much. And we need to reallocate some of their wealth to create a universal basic income for our state's residents who are in poverty, as you mentioned, in Kittitas and Grant County, Lincoln County, Yakima County. We need to reallocate the wealth. Why does a company make $1 trillion and not pay their fair share of taxes. They are hoarding the wealth. It's an unfair system, as we know. Racism is inherent in our economy, in capitalism. It's inherent in our society. Our economy was never made to help people of color, low-income folks, make it out of poverty. And it's time for, as a person of color, I believe it's time, and I believe that it's my duty that as a person that comes from poverty, from Quincy, Washington, who's lived in a trailer home with 4 other families while my parents worked 10-hour shifts in the fields, to advocate for these families who are still around in the area 30 years later, different generation, but are still going through the same socioeconomic impacts now, intertwined with the pandemic and a fire season that's never seen before. I believe it's time to create a state income tax so the wealthy billionaires and trillionaire corporations in our states can help alleviate some of the stress on these low-income families.
Interesting. Yeah, so I did some research on an income tax as well, and it looks like it's been attempted to be done in the past, and yeah, there's still some legal precedent, which seems pretty difficult to overcome. So I guess maybe another hypothetical scenario. Let's say an income tax is, maybe for sake of this point here, impossible due to the Supreme Court ruling, Washington Supreme Court rulings in the past. Is there another type of tax or another method of wealth reallocation or spending reallocation that you would propose or would be top on your list in an effort to solve this problem?
I've also advocated for a capital gains tax when making stock transactions in our states, and coupled with my proposal to legally challenge the state income, the precedent for a state income tax. With enough political and legal will, mountains can be turned. So it's all about the people coming together and advocating for it, and mounting a legal challenge to our unfair tax system in Washington State. And I am willing to put my reputation, my campaign on the line as collateral to advocate for the allocation of the wealth in our states. It's unfair that 4 of the 5 richest folks in the world live in the Puget Sound area, yet they pay little to no taxes into our system in regards to income tax or any other type of equitable tax into our system. So it's time to look for solutions for these multi-billionaires that are now worth over $200 billion while having the best tax lawyers. And it's unfair. They think they are untouchable, but there's more of us than there are of them. So it's all about political will, legal will, and the will of the people to make that change.
Totally. Taking a step back and looking at this on a bit of a larger scale, I think it's kind of hard to deny that we're in a tremendously volatile and ever-changing, really, political sphere, right? Specifically, that comes in the form, I think, of political polarization, distrust in politicians, and distrust in the media in general. And so I guess I'm curious, have you, in your time running for office, in your time observing the 13th District, have you seen this political polarization? And if so, what would you do to try to solve it if you were elected?
Thank you for the question. So yes, I've seen the political polarization in our states and in our country due to the President of the United States, who is fanning the flames of racism and of polarization, to call peaceful protesters terrorists, to make the media the enemy of the state. It's really, really unfortunate. It's horrendous. It's time for a leader to come to the White House and heal the wounds that have been created by President Donald Trump, and taking it back to to the local level here in the 13th district, I feel that I have the potential to reach across the aisle to more conservative folks, as I have served in the military where my opponent has not. I advocate for Second Amendment rights. I am advocating for agricultural well-being, as I've grown up in an agricultural space, and I've worked in agriculture, and I grew up on a farm. I have more in common with conservative folks in my district than they may think they do. And it's all about being recognized as somebody that can cross the bridge of difference and make amends with both sides. I believe that we both want peace. We both want to keep Washington going and find solutions to get over this pandemic and go on with our lives. And I believe the biggest threat to our democracy is stemming from Washington, D.C. So it's all going to come down to November. We will see how that goes. We're going to continue advocating for progressive candidates, and we'll do our part here in Washington State to fix that polarization that you mentioned.
Fantastic, fantastic. Always good to hear that people are against political polarization. I understand we're almost out of time here. Sorry, I was just checking the time. And I don't want to keep you for too long. So I guess I just have one more question for you, Mr. Castañeda-Díaz. I'm curious, if elected to office, what would be your #1 priority? What's the most pressing issue in the 13th district going into November? And
yes, thank you for the question. The most pressing issue is saving our environment, saving our planet. I just got back from speaking in Olympia at an environmental justice summit, where many climate activists came together to ask for more protections in Washington State, to cut ties with fossil fuels. As I mentioned, my opponent is funded by Cascade Natural Gas, Chevron, Phillips 66, and Puget Sound Energy. I believe that we need to be cutting ties with these multinational fossil fuel corporations, and we need to prioritize saving our state from the wildfires. We were choked by smoke for 2 weeks, a few weeks ago, and as we saw on the news last night, the smoke from California is headed back our way. While we can't control the fires of California, we can work in Washington State within our state boundaries and borders to create policy that will prepare us to react and for these climate catastrophe events, as to save human lives. And apart from that, we also have to work on the global pandemic and how we will deal with this. So we have pandemics and fires as the main issue going on right now and into 2021. And for I don't know how much time that these will go on, but we have to address them now.
thank you for that take on the situation. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so that again, that was kind of the last question I had. Again, really appreciate you taking some time out of your day to speak with us. Yeah, thank you. I really can't thank you more.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
You too.